Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 4th chapter in the book of Lamentations. Like every other chapter, it is derivative of some number of 22. Chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 consist of 22 verses, so what we've been doing is breaking them down in halves. And this is the final portion of the Book of Lamentations, which is arranged in what is known as an acrostic. Acrostic is a literary poetical device where each opening letter of every opening word begins in the alphabetical order of the Hebrew language. So verse 1 begins with Aleph, verse 22 always ends in Tau, and in the 3rd chapter, it's not 3 acrostics. It is 66 verses, but it is a single one. And just some of the themes I've been identifying in each chapter, as I've said before in these lessons, is chapter 1 is about the sorrow in Jerusalem. This is a ransacked city, ghost town, a shadow of her former self. Just 3 short years ago, before the siege was laid, she was, a resplendent jewel, and look at what she has become. Then in the 2nd chapter, we read of the rationale for Yahweh's anger at sin. Sin is an offense to the sacred Elohim, whom it offends, and he has every right to respond in wrath once we've sinned away our day of grace. And he was long-suffering with Judah, but they just too many covenant violations added up, and they met their day of doom, and rightly so, in explicit, as they were warned for the consequences of disobedience in the Mosaic covenant. The 3rd chapter is hope in Yahweh's faithfulness. So even as all the world, his world around him is literally destroyed, and he looks to heaven for a greater world, and he has hope in the attribute of faithfulness. So Yahweh, who used these Babylonian instruments, can surely save and redeem those he has cursed and afflicted on earth. And then in the 4th chapter, we read of God, the satisfaction of the divine anger. And the 11th verse, the previous one, previous to the one the closing verse of the previous lesson we read, Yahweh has completed his wrath. He has poured out his burning displeasure and kindled a fire in Zion. So what I did in the predecessor to this lesson was just review chapter 2, because they're thematically connected. And by the way, chapter 5, which is not an acrostic, remember this is the final acrostic portion of this book, is a prayer for restoration. But what I'm going to do is review some of the 11 verses before I hop into this and comment more extensively and in order, the verses 12 through 22. So it opens with a reference to how dim the gold has become. The gold is not literal gold. It is Jerusalem, who are precious and valuable in the sight of Yahweh. And the precious stones of Zion, which were weighed against the fine gold, how they have been reckoned as a clay of pots, the works of the hands of the potter. So there was not and the destruction of the 2nd temple, the Savior says that not stone will be left standing, but the evidence and the inference from Lamentations that the stones in the temple were scattered throughout the streets of the adjacent territory. Even the jackals are flatteringly compared to the humans, the mothers in this wretched city, because jackals, no one likes them, no one respects them, no one really admires them. They're not cute, cuddly animals, but even they care for their young and nurture them and develop them. And the women of Jerusalem did not have that option. Cannibalism was a very literal condition of their present plight. So the tongue of the infant has clung to the roof of his mouth for thirst. Children ask for bread. No one breaks it for them. So there's no food to give or water to give, even for the children who are reliant on adults to provide those necessary vitals for them. And with the mother, it was a choice between feeding themselves and feeding their children. And the condition is described of Jerusalem is described as greater than the sins of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment. So he envies the fate of Sodom. They did not have the special revelation, so they were a greater. With revelation comes responsibility. The Sodomites, they just didn't know any better. They were, engaging in homosexuality and all these illicit, immoral practices because they didn't have the revelation. They were carnal beast of their own baser nature, but they were instantaneously evaporated. The classic case of Old Testament fire and brimstone. They were gone in a moment, but Jerusalem had to endure a 3-year siege, during which time Jeremiah found himself in a dungeon for daring to suggest that the Jerusalem surrendered to the Babylonians in the interest of preserving their temple. So everything he had warned against was literally fulfilled, to add insult to injury. And he just compares how the Nazarites, these were people, we can read of their vows in Numbers 6, had diminished in physical appearance, verses 7 through 8. And in verse 9 he says, "Better off were those pierced by the sword than those pierced by hunger, for these pine away, pierced through the lack of the fruits of the field." So he's comparing death by the sword to be preferable to the slow, agonizing, painful death of hunger. The people who were left survivors of the siege are worse off than those who were slain by the sword during the siege. And again, verse 10 ties to the cannibalism. This is the cannibalistic condition. "The hands of the merciful woman have boiled their own children. They became food for them in the destruction of the daughter of my people." So, what mother would eat their children under normal circumstances? But these weren't normal circumstances. These were real life and death issues of survival. They did not have such a luxury. It was between us and them. And the 11th verse we already read is the satisfaction of his wrath. So all this stuff is the manifestation of his wrath, but it is now henceforth satisfied. And his wrath is likened to fire, a consuming fire, of which we read of in Hebrews 12:29 and also Deuteronomy. So the 12th and first passage of the range we'll be covering today reads, "The kings of the earth did not believe, nor any of the inhabitants of the world, that an adversary and enemy would enter the gates of Jerusalem." So he's referring, there were once an Assyrian under Sennacherib the first or second that was literally outside the gates of Jerusalem, an army 185,000 men strong who were ready to tear down the city, but an angel of Yahweh slew them in a single night. And we can read of this in Isaiah 37. And from that experience, they developed this sort of illusion of immunity. They didn't do anything to ward off the army that was around their walls. It was completely the work of that angel. And the reputation, he says, no kings of the earth could have believed, but that didn't stop them from trying and succeeding. So Nebuchadnezzar succeeded where Sennacherib failed through no fault of his own. There's nothing you can do when an angel of Yahweh is aligned against you. Those 185 soldiers are instantly smithereens. But the illusion of their immunity is henceforth evaporated because they are living in this present predicament, which came as a response to their unrighteousness. "It was because of the sins of her prophets, the wickednesses of her priests, who shed in her midst the blood of the righteous." Now, the prophets that are recorded and referenced throughout scriptures are all real, authentic, and genuine. But for every prophet, there was at least, 4 or 5 or maybe 10 false prophets pleading their message to itching ears, telling them what they wanted to know. They preached peace and security when that wasn't the future reality, and they had led the nation astray. And Jeremiah deals with the false prophets most famously in his 23rd chapter. I did one on that recently. You can type in Corey Johnston. Jeremiah 23:9. I didn't take it all the way to the end of the chapter, and I can't remember the verse on which I concluded. But the priests were also responsible for teaching and instructing and imparting the knowledge of the covenant, and they bore much of the blame for what was happened, because so much revolves and rises and falls and depends upon leadership. So if the prophets and the priests aren't doing their duties and are leading people astray, this is the inevitable consequence, which they have no choice but to contend with now. "They staggered, blind in the streets. They have defiled themselves with blood, so that no one was able to touch their garments." So they are he who walks in spiritual darkness will not be guided by the light, and that is their spiritual condition, but more than metaphorically representative of their physical condition. They had their eyes gouged out, many of them. They were staggering to and fro from A to B, and defiling blood was treated with reverence and respect in the Hebrew culture, and the presence of blood instantly and automatically defiled anything. In fact, one of the Nazirite vows was that they could not touch a dead body. So blood had a defiling quality which rendered one ceremonially impure in the Hebrew culture. And, no one... the problem of having a city is that who's going to tend to their wounds under these covenantal restrictions. They shouted at them, "Away, unclean, away, away, touch not." When they fled in staggering, they said among the Gentiles, "They shall stay no longer." So these were the customary cries of leprous people in Leviticus 14:35, I believe. They are commanded to make their condition known by making their presence known. I'm unclean, I'm coming in their way, and they were to be exiled from the covenant community and the gathering of the central location. And that was true then, but then we find them amongst the Gentiles being fled for lack of welcome in their own land, and they're staggering to them, and they shall stay no longer amongst the Gentiles. The face of Yahweh scattered them. He no longer regards them. They showed no respect for the priest, nor grace to the elders. So the face of Yahweh is personally doing this to them. They have made a powerful enemy who was their most powerful ally. It turned their enemy. They made themselves his enemy. They began as the apple of his eye, the chosen people for a divine and wise purpose, but they had exhausted their trust by lack of loyalty and all the rest, and they had lost his tender affection and concern, but not really. It only seems that way. So he was responding with wrath for a righteous reason, because he is a righteous being, and anything he does, including inflict wrath on his own people, is automatically and as righteous as he is intrinsically so. And priests, they were part of the problem. They were one of the reasons they found themselves in this. So that's why they were treated with scant regard, and the elders wouldn't have necessarily been elder people, but, well, in the New Testament, that term elder is not necessarily an elderly person, but someone in a position of authority or leadership in a local assembly. But here we can imagine, I didn't, in all honesty, research this as thoroughly as I wish I did now that I'm here, but having no choice but to confess my ignorance, I can only surmise that elders is a reference to the elderly people who they were commanded and instructed to by the fifth commandment to show respect for your parents and elders. While we exist, our eyes are consumed, watching vainly for our help. In our watchtower we watch for a nation that could not save. So the reality of being at the mercy, being a small nation at the mercy of what was before this, a sea, a whirlwind of chaos and contention as three respective geopolitical entities battled among and between themselves for supremacy in the ancient Near East at this time. Those three powers were Assyria, who had done what the Babylonians did to Judah. They had done that to Jerusalem and Egypt. And much of the prophets, from beginning with Isaiah, admonitions to the secular kings was to not put your faith in alliances with pagan nations. Put it to Yahweh. He will provide, he will protect, he will take care of you. These pagan nations and their kings are untrustworthy and unreliable. And so we see a witness of the watchman. This was one who stood at the city walls watching for enemies or help or relief, and no one came. They had called and summoned the Egyptians. They had even entered into an alliance when Assyria had the upper hand in that. By this point, Babylonian is the unrivaled and uncontested supreme authority. But during Hezekiah, the great reformer under whom Jerusalem survived the besiegement of the Assyrians, he entered into an alliance with the Babylonians, and in a moment of weakness and pride, he showed the Babylonian guest, the king's envoy, his great treasure and his great wealth. This instilled in them. They knew what was there, and this ultimately provided their incentive to invade and ransack and plunder the city. They have hunted our steps from going in our streets. Our end was near. Our days were completed, for our end has come. So this is where it all ends, at least as far as an independent, sovereign, geopolitical entity. This is the beginning of the Age of Gentiles, which still has not finished, but it began in 586 when the independent nation of Judah ceased to exist for all intents and purposes. So they were at death's door. Their end was near. Their days were completed. What's interesting is that their end was near. Their days were completed. So that's a future tense followed by a past tense, the logical completion of the past tense. And our end had come, so that's a past tense once more. So the end is already here. They have no choice but to live with it and deal with it. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the heavens. They came hotly after us on the mountains and lay in wait for us in the wilderness. So this is a description of the military enemy they were engaged against. They were likened to swifter than the eagles of the sky, and they pursued them outside of the city walls. They were with them in the wilderness. That could have meant desert, and in the mountains. So there was no place for the denizens of Jerusalem to escape where they could not be caught and killed by the Babylonian army, which laid ruin to their sacred city. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of Yahweh, was caught in their pits, in whose shadow he had thought to live among the Gentiles. So Yahweh's anointed would have been David's successor. Zedekiah was the final king of Judah, seated on the throne in Jerusalem. He got trapped in their entangling alliances. He allowed himself to get trapped. He rejected, his advisors compelled him to reject Jeremiah's advice to surrender without resistance. But it did not end well for him. He tried to escape, and while en route to Jericho, the Babylonians caught him, slew his children before his very eyes, and gouged his eyes out, thus literally fulfilling a prophecy of, I think in Ezekiel, where he says that he's going to go to the land of the enemy without seeing it. And the shadow, that just translates as protection. So he thought to live among the Gentiles. He thought, these Gentiles aren't the problems. We can use one to ward off the other, when the whole time they had all the provision and all the protection they could need and rely on and count on in Yahweh above. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. The cup is to pass over you too, so that you become drunk and make yourself naked. So Edom was the nation that had descended from the elder twin brother of Jacob, who is the father and the patriarch of the 12 Jewish tribes. He had an elder brother through whom he ultimately swindled the blessing of Isaac from. And so he became a nation in his own right, Edom, which was located to the south and the east of Judah and Israel. And they had been a perpetual menace. I think at one point in Genesis 36, Jacob and Esau reconcile, but there was more or less permanent personal entanglement between these nations. And the land of Uz was the land from which Job, the earliest written book of the Bible, takes place. That's where Job was from. So they did have a reputation as a center and capital of wisdom. And so they were somewhat refined in the arts conducive to civilization. But the cup is to pass over you. This is the message of Obadiah, because the Edomites, they had entered into an arrangement. They made an alliance with the Babylonians that they too could ransack and plunder the city of their detested enemies, the Jerusalemites. But their day is coming, and they had made themselves drunk. They were intoxicated and inebriated with pride, and they had made themselves naked. Naked is a reason to be ashamed, and they would be ashamed when they were permanently blotted out from the map. So I think in the year 200, not long, they were betrayed by the very Babylonian allies they had solicited. That and I think in the 200s BM, before Messiah, the Arabic people largely overwhelmed their land. So by the time in the New Testament we read that Herod, he was Edomidian, that was the remnant of the nation of Edom, and he was appointed by his Roman masters to be king of the Jews. Your wickedness has been completed, O daughter of Zion. He no longer prolongs your exile. He shall punish your wickedness, O daughter of Edom. He shall uncover your sins. So he's talking to two people here. One is Judah, Jerusalem, daughter of Zion. That is the site and center in the hill, in the mountain of the sacred temple. It was known as Mount Zion. That would have been the center of their affection. And now he's talking to Edom, that their sins, they will have to answer for the sins they had lived in and basked in and treasured and nourished, and they will not go unpunished, and rightly so, because Yahweh reserves his wrath not only for the Sodomites, the people who had no inkling of an idea of through special revelation. All they had was their instincts, and they had led them astray. So the non-covenant nations are not exempt from judgment, and we Americans are not, strictly speaking, a covenant nation, but if it could happen to the apple of Yahweh's eye, the Israel and Judah of the Old Testament, divine judgment can surely come to us. And I'm convinced that it's the presence and the continuation and the existence of a righteous remnant which sticks with us as we become increasingly a post-Christian society that has thus far preserved this nation from its eventual extinction. And we must be extinct by the book of Revelation. There's going to be a one-world government. We, too, our independent sovereignty will one day cease to exist, and this thing must come to pass. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.